The air snapped with the kind of tension that made even the birds shut up. I was knee-deep in mud, wrenching a stubborn fence post from what used to be my barnyard, when the first shriek echoed across the valley. Not the kind of scream that warns of real danger, but that shrill, nasal, world owes me whine that every rural neighborhood dreads. Karen. She stood where my hayloft used to cast a shadow, now looming in a billow of sun hat and sheer white cover-up, screeching instructions at a crew of shirtless contractors who looked about as thrilled as a herd of cows before a thunderstorm. She was holding a laminated printout, probably some list of HOA-approved paint colors or bylaws about grass height, but it didn't matter. Because, as of this morning, what used to be my grandfather's old red barn was a pile of splintered wood, replaced by an in-ground pool the size of a small lake. My pool, apparently, according to her. I should have been angrier, but after 3 years living next to Karen and her personal war on rural blight, my outrage reflex was as numb as a winter toe. She'd started small, letters about my mailbox's color, complaints about the smell of manure after a rain, veiled threats about my rusty truck, lowering property values. It escalated to complaints with the HOA, then actual code enforcement. But demolishing my barn for a pool? That was new. It was also impossible to ignore. And as I stood there, fists full of muddy fence wire, I realized, she really believed she could just erase my life for the sake of her pool party season. The kicker was that my barn wasn't even on her property. The surveyor stakes I'd driven myself were still poking out of the weeds, fluorescent tape snapping in the wind. I double-checked the plats, pored over every faded deed. But Karen, self-appointed empress of the HOA, had apparently decided that lines on a map were mere suggestions, and her pool plans didn't include rustic old barns blocking her resort view. Now the contractors, guys I knew from church, who normally repaired roofs and built decks, were tossing scraps of my family's history onto a dump truck. I locked eyes with Mike, the lead guy, and he just shook his head with the world-weary defeat of a man who'd seen too many HOA meetings. That's when Karen spotted me. She clicked her tongue, marched over in white sandals, and waved her printout like a royal decree. "You're trespassing. This area's closed for construction. HOA approved." She put special venom into those last 2 words, like HOA was the Supreme Court. I wanted to laugh, but instead I wiped my hands on my jeans and asked, "Since when does the HOA get to build pools on land they don't own?" She smiled the way snakes smile in cartoons, all teeth and triumph. "We voted last month. You missed the meeting." Of course I had. The meeting was at 3 in the afternoon, during calving season, and the agenda was hidden behind her usual spam about lawn maintenance. As she turned away, barking at the workers to level out that dirt, "I want a clean edge," I felt a slow, steady fury build in my chest. Not the kind that makes you explode and get hauled away by the sheriff, but the deep, calculating kind that knows how to bide its time. I wasn't about to let my family's legacy become the foundation for a shallow end and a set of floating flamingos. But Karen had made her move, and now the game was on. The barn was gone, the pool was half dug, and the only thing standing between her and suburban domination was whatever revenge I could cook up with nothing but a pile of memories and a lifetime of grudges. I spent that afternoon walking the edges of my land, boots squelching in mud, plotting. Every fence post, every gnarled tree, every rut in the dirt had a story that Karen would never understand. She saw property lines as dotted suggestions, but I saw them as living boundaries, promises kept by sweat, stubbornness, and more than a little bull-headedness. That was when I remembered my literal bull, Buster, a 3-year-old black Angus with a mean streak for anyone who looked at him funny. He'd been exiled to a neighbor's pasture after Karen filed a noise complaint about his midnight bellowing. Now, with my barn gone and the fences down, Buster was due for a homecoming. As dusk fell, I drove over to Jerry's farm, where Buster had been terrorizing the local goats, and loaded him into the trailer. Jerry grinned when I told him why I needed the bull back. "Don't get mad, get even," he said, handing me an extra bag of feed. I told him not to worry, I had no plans to get mad. Karen wanted a pool, she'd get the full barnyard experience. The next morning, Karen's construction site looked like a set from a reality show, workers hammering, backhoes rumbling, Karen herself pacing the edge of the pit with a fresh iced coffee. I backed my trailer up to what used to be the south fence line, threw open the gate, and let Buster loose. He took one look at the chaos, snorted, and charged straight through a stack of pool tiles, scattering laborers like bowling pins. Karen shrieked and climbed onto a folding chair, white cover-up flapping, as Buster circled the pit, bellowing at every stranger in sight. The contractors refused to set foot near the pool while Buster was on patrol. Work halted. Karen called animal control, who just laughed and told her livestock had right-of-way in agricultural zoning. Her resort view now featured one very angry bull and a steady stream of manure. She tried to glare me into submission, but I just tipped my hat and said, "Looks like Buster missed home." The game was on, and Karen had no idea what she'd started. By the time the sun set, half the neighborhood had gathered to watch the spectacle. Kids dangled over fences, parents whispered and pointed, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of Karen's petty tyranny start to crack. The pool was nothing but a muddy hole, my barn was gone, but Buster was back, and as I watched Karen storm back inside, screaming into her phone, I realized she'd finally met her match. Not with lawyers, not with bylaws, but with the stubborn, relentless spirit she'd tried to bulldoze out of existence. And I was just getting started. By sunrise the next day, word had traveled faster than a wildfire in August. Karen's pool project was now the talk of every porch, feed store, and church pew for 3 counties. I couldn't walk into the diner for coffee without getting a thumbs up, a quiet "go get her," or, my favorite, a sly grin and, "heard Buster found a new wallow." Small towns never forget a good show, and a rampaging bull in a future HOA pool was better than fireworks. Of course, I wasn't naive enough to think this would end with a single prank. Karen was a woman who didn't just hold grudges. She built luxury condos for them and installed infinity pools on the roof. The only thing bigger than her ego was her Rolodex of HOA allies, and by the time I finished my first cup of coffee, I could already sense the wheels turning across the street. Sure enough, at precisely 9:17 a.m., a convoy of SUVs rolled up, shiny as beetles and 3 times as determined. Out came the HOA's finest. Karen, in a new linen blazer, her lapdog Marcia clutching a stack of violation notices, and 2 men I'd never seen before, one with a laser-measured tape, the other with a drone. Karen's eyes zeroed in on me, arms folded, mouth set like she was trying to crush a lemon with her teeth. "We need to discuss your animal control violations," she called, voice echoing across the torn-up yard. I leaned against the fence, radiating the kind of calm that comes from watching 100 headstrong calves break loose and somehow still making it home for dinner. "You mean Buster? He's just grazing on my land, Karen. Maybe you ought to put up a fence if you don't want visitors." She ignored the jab. Marcia, tall, bony, and perpetually clutching a clipboard, began reading from a list that sounded suspiciously like the HOA's greatest hit. Excessive noise. Unsightly livestock. Destruction of property. Failure to control animals. She rattled them off as if the words alone could regrow my barn and turn Buster into a garden gnome. I almost admired the sheer volume of legalese she could fit on a single page. The men with the tape and drone started measuring, zipping back and forth, mapping every inch of my property and the pool crater. The drone buzzed overhead, snapping photos of Buster lying majestically in the center of Karen's precious construction site, chewing cud and occasionally rolling in the soft dirt. The spectacle was pure gold for the neighborhood, but Karen didn't see the humor. She was a woman under siege, and she was gathering ammunition. By noon, I had a thick manila envelope shoved in my mailbox, threats of fines, court dates, mandatory HOA mediation. The best line, by far, was intentional harassment of a community project. I laughed out loud, but even as I grinned, I started to plot. Karen wasn't going to back down, and as much as I loved a good showdown, I didn't have the time or money to let this become a legal siege. So I did what every sensible rural resident does in a crisis. I called in reinforcements. First was my cousin Troy, who happened to be the town's unofficial historian and, more importantly, a notary. I needed every deed, plat, and historic photo I could get, proof that the barn and now, by extension, Buster, had every right to exist where it always had. Troy arrived with a box of dusty folders and a phone full of scanned documents. Together, we traced property lines dating back to the original homestead, cross-referencing survey maps and, for good measure, Troy's 5th grade science fair project, a diorama of the barn, complete with plastic cows. When I brought the papers to the next HOA meeting, Karen tried to dismiss them, but her voice faltered when Troy started quoting statute numbers. The board, mostly tired retirees who just wanted to avoid drama, shifted in their seats, suddenly less eager to back her latest crusade. But Karen wasn't done. The very next morning, construction resumed, at least until Buster reasserted his territory by chasing a cement mixer down the gravel path. That's when Karen called the sheriff. Deputy Warner, a no-nonsense woman who'd coached me in Little League, arrived with sirens blaring. She took one look at the chaos, one look at the paperwork in my hands, and another at Karen's red face. "Ma'am, unless you can prove this animal's a threat or trespassing, he's got more right to this ground than your pool does." Karen sputtered, demanding Warner arrest me, but Warner just tipped her hat and winked. "Maybe think twice before demolishing a man's barn, Karen." As she pulled away, a wave of laughter rippled through the watching neighbors. Karen's supporters tried to salvage her dignity, muttering about outsiders and progress, but they were losing the crowd. That night, the real twist came. I got a call from Jerry, my neighbor, Buster's previous landlord, and a guy who had little patience for HOA theatric. "Saw something weird, thought you should know," he said, voice low. "Karen's been talking to some city folks, real estate type. Spotted them surveying the other side of your property late. Looks like she's pitching more than just a pool." The gears in my mind clicked. Karen didn't want just a pool. She wanted a full-blown private club, maybe even a spa and a tennis court, something that would lock out locals and push the rest of us off what little space we still called ours. Armed with that nugget, I changed my game. Instead of playing defense, I started gathering allies. I met with neighbors, especially the older families who remembered the way things used to be. We organized, pooling our documents and, crucially, our stories. At the next HOA meeting, we showed up en masse. I brought a binder stuffed with history and signatures, but the real power was in the people. Mrs. Daniels, who'd milked cows in my old barn as a child, the Morales twins, who'd learned to drive stick in my pasture, even grumpy old Frank, who claimed Buster had once saved him from a charging goose. For every threat Karen lobbed, we countered with proof, precedent, and, most of all, a tidal wave of public support. Still, Karen was nothing if not tenacious. Her final move of the week was a showstopper. She hired private security, black uniforms and all, to secure the construction site and keep out trespassers and livestock. Suddenly, my own land looked like a military base, patrolled by grim-faced guards who scowled at everyone, including the mail carrier. The HOA newsletter went out that night. Safety and order restored. Karen probably poured herself a victory margarita, confident she'd won. But as I watched those guards glare at Buster, who now spent his days lounging defiantly in a lawn chair I dragged to the middle of the pit, I felt something shift. Karen had finally gone too far, drawing a line in the sand that nobody in town could ignore. She'd turned a simple grudge into a full-scale turf war, and as I looked at the faces of my neighbors, angry, united, and ready, I realized Karen's world was about to get a whole lot smaller. And this time, it wouldn't just be my bull running wild. The next morning, it was like living inside a bad action movie, minus the explosions, but plenty of dramatic standoffs and ridiculous costumes. Karen's newly hired security squad arrived before sunrise, stomping around my pasture in matching black windbreakers, radios squawking, as if expecting to find me running a moonshine operation instead of a retired barn and one stubborn bull. They set up folding barricades at the edge of the construction site, placed private property signs on my own fences, and strutted around with clipboards and flashlights, even though the sun was blazing. The scene would have been funny if it wasn't so deeply, infuriatingly real. I kept my cool, sipping my coffee on the porch and letting them sweat it out under the July heat. From my vantage, I could see Karen at the edge of her lawn, arms flailing, berating the guards for letting Buster within 50 feet of the sacred pool pit. Meanwhile, the neighbors watched from behind curtains and hedges, phones out, capturing every bit of the show for the next HOA group chat. Marcia, clutching her ever-present clipboard, stalked the perimeter like a prison warden, barking orders at anyone who so much as looked at the hole in the ground. The whole thing had the vibe of a reality show gone off the rails, with Karen directing every cringeworthy scene. But things escalated faster than I expected. By noon, one of the guards, clearly new to the concept of livestock, made the tactical error of approaching Buster with a broom, intending to shoo him off the property. Buster, never one to pass up the opportunity for chaos, squared up and let out a bellow so loud it rattled the windows. The guard froze, eyes wide, before bolting for the safety of Karen's patio, tripping over a stack of chaise lounges and earning a round of applause from the neighborhood kids watching through the fence. Karen screamed at me from across the yard, threatening everything from lawsuits to animal control raids, but the only thing she managed to achieve was getting Buster even more riled up. He responded by plopping himself directly in the middle of the pool pit and refusing to move, tail swishing, sending up clouds of dust. That's when the real circus began. The contractors, already spooked by Buster's reputation and Karen's relentless nagging, began to pack up their tools. "Not worth it, lady," I overheard one mutter, wiping sweat from his brow. "This ain't what we signed up for." Within an hour, the site was deserted, save for Karen, her shrinking entourage of HOA loyalists, and the increasingly bored security guards, who now had nothing to guard except a hole, a bull, and a truly embarrassing HOA scandal. But Karen, ever resourceful, switched tactics again. That evening, I found a registered letter duct-taped to my mailbox, a cease and desist from a downtown law firm, accusing me of reckless endangerment and property sabotage. The threat was clear: back down, move Buster, and let the pool construction continue, or face the full legal wrath of the HOA. My hands shook a little as I read it, not from fear, but from the sheer absurdity of how far she was willing to go. But I'd grown up on this land, I'd buried dogs and planted trees, and learned to ride a bike on the gravel drive. Karen's pool was temporary. My roots weren't. So I did what any sensible person would do: I doubled down. I reached out to every neighbor who'd ever had a run-in with Karen or the HOA. Turns out, my story was just the latest in a long string of entitlement and overreach. One family had been fined for letting their kids set up a lemonade stand too close to the curb. Another had their garden gnome forcibly removed for being too whimsical. I invited them all over for what I called a barnyard strategy meeting. We met on lawn chairs around the crater that used to be my barn, with Buster standing sentry and the guards looking on, powerless and confused. It was a brainstorming session for the ages. Ideas flew. Some legal, some questionable, all satisfying. Mrs. Morales, who'd been hit with a dozen noise complaints for her backyard mariachi parties, suggested we demand a full audit of the HOA's finances. Tom, the former board member who'd quit in protest over Karen's power grab, offered to leak the board's group chat logs to the local paper. Even Mrs. Daniels, who rarely left her porch, volunteered her son's drone to capture video evidence of the security harassing residents on private property. It was more than just pettiness now. It was about defending our way of life from a woman who wanted to turn the whole neighborhood into her personal resort. The turning point came when Mrs. Daniels' drone caught the guards throwing beer cans into the woods and shouting threats at neighborhood teenagers. I uploaded the footage to a shared drive and sent it to every homeowner. By the next day, the HOA's group chat was in flames, and half the board demanded an emergency meeting. Karen, who had ruled with fear and technicalities, suddenly found herself under real scrutiny. Her supporters started to drop off, one by one, as the threat of lawsuits, police attention, and public embarrassment grew. Even the security company, after seeing the drone footage on Facebook, pulled their guards off-site, citing hostile work environment and unmanageable livestock. But the biggest twist of all came late that night, when an email from the county land use office pinged into my inbox. Subject: Urgent zoning violation complaint. Apparently, Karen's pool project didn't just violate a few handshake agreements. It was in direct violation of at least 3 county ordinances, including the destruction of a historic structure, my barn, without proper permits or notification to the surrounding properties. Someone, perhaps a helpful neighbor or a certain drone-savvy old lady, had reported the whole mess to the county. The message was clear. A formal investigation was opening, effective immediately. Construction was ordered to halt, and a county inspector would be out first thing in the morning. That night, for the first time since my barn came down, I slept easy. Karen's crusade had officially turned into an investigation, and the power she wielded through fear and intimidation was dissolving in the light of public scrutiny and real legal consequences. I knew she wouldn't give up easily. Her ego was bulletproof, but the tide was turning. And as I watched Buster graze under the stars, peaceful and stubborn as ever, I felt a surge of hope. The game had changed, and for the first time, Karen wasn't the only one writing the rules. The county inspector arrived before sunrise, his battered white pickup rolling to a stop beside the crater that was once my family barn. He climbed out slow, eyes scanning the site, notebook already in hand. His boots crunched over the shattered lumber and trampled grass as Karen, now with a visible twitch in her jaw, rushed out in a pastel tracksuit, trying to intercept him. I hung back at my porch, mug in hand, watching the whole scene unfold like I was at the movies and had front row seat. The inspector wasn't buying her act for a second. He brushed off her stream of legalese and HOA jargon, pointing out the obvious. No visible permits, no historic demolition approval, not a single neighbor's signature for the community improvement, Karen kept rambling about. It was almost impressive how quickly her confidence dissolved the moment she realized someone had real authority. A crowd gathered as word spread. By the time the inspector started snapping photos and marking measurements, the sidewalk was lined with neighbors, Mrs. Daniels with her oxygen tank, the Morales twins recording on their phones, even old man Franklin, who hadn't left his porch in 6 months but showed up for the drama. Karen kept trying to steer the conversation, but every question circled back to the missing paperwork, the blatant zoning violations, and the destruction of a century-old barn. She pointed to the pool pit, declaring it essential for property values. The inspector just raised an eyebrow and jotted note. The best part was watching her freeze as he read the clause about livestock, agricultural land, original structures, historic use, all protected unless specifically rezoned with full county review. Buster, as if on cue, wandered into the scene, nudging a chunk of red barn wood with his nose, perfectly at home. It was clear whose land this really was. By noon, the inspector handed Karen a bright orange stop-work order. She shrieked, tried to yank it from his hand, then realized the entire neighborhood was recording. Her mask cracked, and for a moment she just stood there, shoulders slumped, mouth open, completely lost. The contractors, who had trickled back to see if the drama was over, packed up their tools in silence. The pool was officially dead. But Karen wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She stormed back inside her house, emerging half an hour later with a thick folder and an expression that could curdle milk. She marched right over to my porch, flanked by Marcia and her last loyal board member, Ted. "You did this," she spat, waving the folder. "You and your circus. Your animal. Your lies. You just wait. My lawyers will eat you alive." I smiled and sipped my coffee, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "County says otherwise, Karen. Maybe you should have read the fine print before knocking down someone else's barn." Ted, for once, looked unsure. Marcia, pale and sweating, clutched her clipboard like it was a life raft. That afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting was called in the community clubhouse. I went, not out of obligation, but for the spectacle. The place was packed to the walls. Residents, fence-sitters, even a few real estate agents who'd smelled blood in the water. Karen took the floor, ranted about personal vendettas, backward thinking, and how the neighborhood would decay without her leadership. She tried to whip the crowd into a frenzy, but nobody cheered. Instead, people started telling their own stories, of overreach, unfair fines, and threats. Mrs. Morales described how her flower beds had been dug up for being too bright. The Parker kids shared how their lemonade stand had been shut down twice for noise pollution. It was like a dam breaking, years of resentment finally spilling out. When my turn came, I kept it simple. I explained how my family had built that barn by hand, how it had stood for generations, and how I hadn't just lost a building, but a piece of who I was. I didn't ask for sympathy. I just told the truth, letting the facts and history speak for themselves. That landed harder than any speech, real, raw, and undeniable. One by one, the crowd turned. People who had once stayed quiet out of fear or politeness stood up and demanded change. Karen lost control of the room. The board, tired, defensive, outnumbered, voted on an emergency measure. Suspension of Karen's presidency pending a full investigation, an audit of all recent HOA projects, and a review of the rules she'd been using as a cudgel. The vote wasn't even close. When it was over, Karen tried to protest, but nobody listened. She left the clubhouse alone, her followers trailing behind in silence. I'd like to say I felt triumphant, but mostly I just felt relief. My neighbors, free from Karen's intimidation, began planning how to fix the damage she'd caused, not just to my land, but to the whole community. We formed committees to review policies, restore gardens, and replace the barn. This time, as a community event. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter, the future more hopeful. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the day's chaos faded, I wandered back to the ruins of my barn. Buster stood there, calm and content, chewing his cud and watching the fireflies. I sat beside him on the splintered boards, letting the quiet settle in. I thought about my grandfather, how proud he'd be to see the town stand up for itself, to see a bunch of nobodies remind a self-appointed queen that the land belongs to those who love it. The pain of losing the barn was still sharp, but now there was something new in its place. Resolve, unity, and the unbreakable spirit of neighbors who'd had enough. But I knew Karen. She'd never leave quietly, not when she could cause one more storm on her way out. And just as I was getting ready to turn in, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Jerry, my friend across the valley. The text was short, but chilling. Karen's called in outside help. You better be ready. I stared into the gathering dark, the weight of those words sinking in. One last storm was brewing, and this time, Karen wasn't just fighting for her ego, she was fighting to keep her throne. I wasn't scared. I was ready. If she wanted a final showdown, I'd meet her head-on. And this time, I had the whole town behind me. The final act didn't begin with a bang but with a rumble, a steady procession of unfamiliar vehicles crawling up the lane just after dawn. SUVs with tinted windows, a moving truck, a pair of shiny sedans with out-of-state plates. At the front of the line was Karen, flanked by two men in crisp suits and a severe woman who looked like she hadn't smiled since Y2K. I watched from the kitchen window, pouring my coffee slow, letting the scene unfold like a high-stakes chess match. Buster was already awake, grazing lazily by the fence, his shadow long in the early sun. The neighborhood, still tender from yesterday's reckoning, seemed to hold its breath. They set up at Karen's house, moving boxes, laptops, binders, stacks of legal pads, even a portable printer. The suits walked the perimeter, whispering and pointing at the barn ruins and the pit where Karen's pool dreams had drowned. One man held up a drone, sending it up for a fresh survey. My phone pinged within minutes, a notification from the community Facebook group. Who are Karen's new friends? The thread exploded in real time. Some speculated lawyers, others guessed real estate developers, a few joked about a hit squad for rogue livestock. But after a few phone calls, we got our answer. A law firm out of the city, a real estate consultant, and, most alarming, a property management company. Karen was making her last, most desperate play. She wanted to put my land and a good chunk of the neighborhood up for sale, using every legal loophole and technicality she could find. I could feel the old panic nipping at me, the same dread that came when the barn fell and the pool diggers showed up. But this time, I didn't face it alone. A steady stream of neighbors appeared at my door with coffee, paperwork, copies of their deeds, even a batch of fresh muffins from Mrs. Daniels. We set up camp on my porch, laptops open, a war room fueled by caffeine and stubbornness. Troy was already calling the county clerk, cross-checking every plat and title from the last 50 years. Mrs. Morales typed up an official complaint, while Tom, the ex-board member, handled the news media, feeding them every detail of Karen's overreach. By mid-morning, a local news van rolled up, camera crew in tow, hungry for the next viral story. Across the street, Karen's team grew more frantic. Suits scurried between laptops and piles of legal documents, one of them waving papers in the air, shouting into a phone. I could almost hear Karen's voice through the double-pane glass, sharp, desperate, clinging to her story that she was the savior of the subdivision, the only one who could bring order. But the real twist came when the county inspector returned, not alone this time, but with a sheriff's deputy and an official from the State Historical Society. They walked the property, comparing maps, questioning Karen's lawyers, scribbling notes. The deputy spoke with me for 10 minutes, calm but firm, wanting every detail of the barn's history, my family's ownership, the timeline of Karen's actions. I handed over every document we'd gathered, every faded photograph, even a video of my grandfather's barn raising from the 1950s. The Historical Society official's eyes lit up when he saw it. By lunchtime, the mood had shifted. The inspector posted a second notice. This time, a full injunction barring any sale, construction, or modification on the disputed land pending a county review. Karen's team argued, threatened, and tried to hand out their own notices, but the deputy shut them down. This is a civil matter now. Step back, or you'll spend the night in county lockup. Karen stood frozen, fists clenched at her sides, the control she'd wielded for so long draining from her face. But Karen wasn't built for surrender. She pivoted, staging a press conference in her driveway, complete with a folding table, microphones, and a banner she must have had made weeks ago. Protect our neighborhood. She gave a speech full of half-truths, accusing me and half the town of sabotage, conspiracy, and refusing to modernize. She waved her stack of binders, called herself a victim, and declared that change cannot be stopped by the ignorant few. What she didn't count on was how sick everyone was of her voice. By the time the reporters turned their cameras on me, the crowd behind her had thinned to a handful of loyalists. I kept it simple, the same way I had at the HOA meeting. Facts, history, and the truth about what had really happened. I spoke about the barn, my family, Buster, the town's right to its own future, and the value of standing up for what mattered. For once, nobody shouted me down. That afternoon, the sheriff's office hosted a public forum at the community center. It was standing room only. The Historical Society presented their findings, confirming the barn's protected status and the land's agricultural designation. The inspector detailed the violations, the missing permits, the ignored notices. Neighbors took the mic, telling story after story of Karen's reign of pettiness, her threats, her fines, the fear that had kept them silent for too long. I saw Karen shrink a little with every word, her power unraveling in real time. When the county commissioner announced an investigation into the HOA and recommended Karen be barred from holding any position of authority, the room erupted in applause. That should have been the end. But Karen had one last card, a lawsuit against me, claiming intentional infliction of emotional distress and sabotage of communal assets. It was her last gasp, a desperate attempt to cling to relevance. The day of the hearing, the whole town showed up. I stood in court with my neighbors, lawyers from the state, and the county inspector. Karen's lawyer sputtered, waved binders, but the judge, an old family friend, wasn't having it. He dismissed the case before lunch, then issued a stern warning to Karen and the HOA. No further action on the property without full community approval and oversight. The ruling was swift, final, and devastating. When I stepped out of the courthouse, the sun was shining, the sky impossibly clear. My phone buzzed, a dozen texts from neighbors, a photo of Buster lounging where my barn once stood, a makeshift sign on the fence that read, "Welcome home." That night we held a bonfire on my land. The town showed up with casseroles, beer, even a bluegrass band. We laughed, we ate, we shared stories of the old barn and plans for the new one. For the first time in years we felt like a community again. As the fire died down and the stars came out, I leaned on the fence, watching Buster graze in the moonlight. The ruins of the old barn were still there, but now they were surrounded by people who cared. Karen's house was dark, her banners gone, her reign over. The scars she left would take time to heal, but we were finally free to begin. I realized then that this land wasn't just mine or my family's, it belonged to all of us who'd fought to protect it. And as I looked around at the faces in the firelight, I knew we'd never let anyone, Karen, HOA, or anyone else, try to take it away again.